The poor are not investing because they're poor because they're not investing. People that invest, they're actually able to get returns, but that's beside the point. That's the one point that aggravates me the most, is how his logic is actually reversed. So, how many people have seen that video before? Has anyone? One person? So I'm guessing most people have not seen this video yet? That was the first time? Okay, thank you. And this is, obviously it's unsettling, and obviously it's saying, well, there's something wrong with the system and we need to do something to make it right, and well, yes, we do, but of course any of the solutions that they're trying to implement are actually not the proper solutions, because what is the reason that I'm doing, why am I doing all of this? What is the purpose of the submersion chart? And we haven't even gotten to the submersion chart yet. So again, why do the poor get poorer? Now, I just want to touch really briefly. The rich get richer because they know and understand the proper principles of finances, so of course they make more money. So why is it that the poor, if instead of just staying poor, or being poor and staying poor as time progresses, why do they get poorer? That's the question, right? Now here's the thing. What the submersion chart is there to do, it's there to prove that the reason that the poor get poorer is 100%, absolutely, completely political. The reason that the poor get poorer is completely the politician's fault. Now, who thinks that that's a pretty strong claim? Does anyone think that that's too strong? Of course, in this audience, I don't think so. But the thing is, there are other people who might think that that's a pretty hefty claim, and say, if I'm talking to some liberal out there, say, there's no way you can prove it. It's all the rich fat cats. They're the ones that are making poor people poorer. It's not the politicians. It's the fat cats. But of course, well, we're going to prove otherwise. So here's where we actually come to the submersion chart. Now I actually have these. Dan is going to hand them out. How many people actually have pens or pencils, something that they can write with? I hope most of you do. Fantastic. And of course, if you don't, then see if you can either borrow from your neighbor, or there are some pens from the school, from the front desk, and actually Katie is holding up the thingy of pens, and they have little flowers on them. So please, please, please make sure that the pens with the flowers get back into, back into the bin in the back, because, well, the Gaddies are awesome in letting us use this facility, and those are the Gaddies pens, so we want to make sure that the Gaddies get their pens back. So ultimately, one of the main reasons I have this little handout is so that you can, one, go along with me as I do this, but two, if you actually have it in front of you, then you'll actually remember it longer. See, the shortest pencil is better than the longest memory. So if you're actually doing this little chart at the same time, then this will help you to remember this information. And of course, the more you remember it, the easier it is for you to share with someone else, right? Because if you don't remember what we're talking about, how can you share it with someone else? So that's one of the reasons that these handouts are created. So does everybody have a handout? Is anyone missing a handout? All right, fantastic. We will continue. So right at the moment, essentially what we have here is, just like the other chart, we have the different quintiles. See, I said a smart sounding word. So we have Mr. Poor Guy right here, and then we have the somewhat less than average guy, the average guy, the better than average guy, and then the Mr. Rich guy up at the very, very top, right? So now there's always going to be quintiles. If you take any population and divide it into quintiles, then you'll always have this. Now one of the cool things in America, here in the United States of America, well, just like what you said, this guy, the Mr. Rich guy, he is doing spectacular. But of course, Mr. Poor Guy in America, guess what? He still has a car, he still has air conditioning, he still has a refrigerator. And most of the time they actually have cable, and cable is one of the reasons that they're poor, because they sit home and do nothing. But sorry, I'm on a tangent. But the thing is, Mr. Poor Guy in the United States of America is still much better off than Mr. Poor Guy in some other country. So I just want to do that really quick. So, oh, right here, at the very, very bottom, on your little chart it says BL, and that stands for the bottom line. And ultimately, and on the bottom of the little chart, so you see on your handout you have the chart, and then you have all of the lines below that, and we're going to fill those in. If you want to write out, is it printed out? Yes, it already says bottom line. And ultimately what the bottom line is that's how much time, effort, energy, and we're actually going to translate that into dollars, how much it costs in order to survive. In order to have enough to survive, you must have more than the bottom line. So there's a certain amount of time, effort, energy in order to make sure that you have some shelter, a roof over your head, in order to make sure that you have enough water, in order to make sure that you have enough food, you have to expend a certain amount of stuff, time, effort, energy, or in this case, money, in order to survive. So what I want you to do first is right where you see the bottom line, take your pencil and draw a line straight across here. So everyone that's above that line still survives. If you fall below this line, well, guess what? You're not really alive anymore, right? So draw a line straight across. Now the next thing, and actually go ahead and tap on that, and yes, there's the line right there. So next thing, we do live in a civilized society, right? Oh, and actually on the little handout, let's fill it out really quick. Now, who pays for that bottom line? And of course, essentially the two answers are you or someone else, right? So ultimately, who pays for that? Well, you pay for it if you're the one surviving, right? So go ahead and write yourself in for who pays for that. And then ultimately, who created it? Now for this time, this is actually sort of unique. In this spot, you're actually going to write in life because, well, if you're alive, then you need to fit into the bottom line, or you need to be above the bottom line. If you fall below that line, then you're dead. So life is the one that creates that bottom line. So is everybody approximately caught up? So, yeah, life is who created the bottom line. Now next, we do live in a civilized society. We do have streets, we do have police officers, we do have fire department, and of course that requires a certain amount of money, right? So, because we live in this nice civilized society, then they created taxes. So what we'll do on this little chart, what you'll do is right next to the chart, you'll just put the letter T, and then down below the chart where it has that space for the number 1 space, you'll write out taxes. So, are taxes voluntary or mandatory? I mean, you can't basically go, you know what, today I don't think I'm going to pay taxes today. So yes, it's not voluntary at all. It is mandatory, so go ahead and circle mandatory. And of course, who pays taxes? Well, I guess what we'll do, instead of doing the you or someone else, I think what we're actually going to do is we'll have the 3 options. We'll do everybody, most people, well, we can do everybody, most people, some people, nobody. So we'll have 4 different options as far as who pays for it. Okay, so those are the 4 options. Everybody pays for it, most people pay for it, some people pay for it, or nobody pays for it. So, who pays taxes? Everybody or nobody? Everybody. Oh, you raised your hand, so you pay taxes. So go ahead and write in everybody pays taxes, and then of course, do you pay them, is it something that affects you directly, indirectly, or taxes don't affect you at all? Essentially, if you're working, then it does affect you directly. And then of course, who created taxes? Well, it's the politicians who care so much for the people. They're the ones that created the taxes so they could pay for the fire department and the police department and pay for the roads and libraries, etc., and so on. And everything that I did mention actually they are worthwhile endeavors going towards taxation. fire department, police department, etc. Those are good things. And of course, when we get extravagant taxes, if we start being taxed for a whole bunch of stuff that's wrong, well, what actually happens to this line? So, I mean, an understandable amount of taxes, that's understandable, but of course, if the government just starts spending and spending and spending and more taxes, what happens to this line? This line actually goes up, doesn't it? Now, if we look at this chart, we have Mr. Rich Guy over here. He can pretty much afford anything and everything that he wants. So if he wants to buy a house, he can actually pay for the house cash because he has all of this money. And of course, this guy might be able to buy a house cash, this amount. This guy, he can buy a car cash, but he'll probably have to finance a house. This guy over here, well, he'll probably have to finance a house or a car. But Mr. Poor Guy, he really can't do much because this is the amount of freedom that he has. He makes this much money, and of course that much is what's taken away because of, well, he needs to survive and he has to pay for taxes. And I do want to do a little thingy. All of that I'm explaining right now, it's not exact numbers. As you can see, there's really no dollar amount on there at all. It's a relationship. So obviously taxes, for most people, taxes are not going to be that percentage of their income. But of course, it's just a relationship. That bottom line is higher because you pay taxes. And because that's higher, that's more of your income that you don't get to choose where it goes. Okay, so in other words, that's less freedom. So before taxes, this is how much freedom Mr. Poor Guy had. After taxes, this is how much freedom Mr. Poor Guy had. So everybody get the point that I'm trying to do with these lines? This is understandable, okay? So next we'll go to, because Mr. Poor Guy, he only has that small amount of freedom, he can't save for retirement. So guess what? These wonderful, sweet politicians who care so much for the people created a new program. And that new program is, Social Security, exactly. So what you can do is in the number 2 part, on the chart you just write SS for Social Security, and then down in the bottom you can write out Social Security and spell it out. And of course, if you need spell check on your piece of paper, then I haven't designed a piece of paper that has a little red squiggly line, so sorry about that. But yes, go ahead and write that out down below. And go ahead and fill out most of those, because who pays for Social Security? Everybody? Most people? Some people? Nobody? Well, everyone who has an income pays for it. If you don't, so if you have zero income at all, then you actually get to mark the little no, you're not directly affected. But of course, are you indirectly affected when someone else pays Social Security? I mean, say for example, if you're going to buy a gallon of milk in the store, they have all of their employees that pay Social Security. Well, you're actually helping to pay for their Social Security bill, right? So you're indirectly affected. Did you have a question really quick, Tim? Civil service? Fantastic, because, well, the people who, yes. So there are some people that are not directly affected, but again, pretty much everybody is at least indirectly affected by Social Security. And of course, with this, who pays for it? Basically, whether it's the Social Security or the federal program for the civil service, it is taking money away from the pool that there is. So go ahead and do the line across. Oh, yeah, so go ahead and write the line across because that bottom line is coming up. And of course, so now we have Mr. Poor Guy that's completely underwater. To the extent that he is not paying that bills, or those bills, the government is making up that difference. So in essence, you know, the government is taking money from here and filling in that gap. So that guy is still alive, but he is now dependent on the government. He has been submerged in debt. So he is not independent anymore. He has been captivated. Now, of course, right at this moment, in this scenario, if this guy breaks his arm, Mr. Rich Guy, he can go to the hospital. And of course, most of these guys can go to the hospital. But of course, this guy and of course this guy, if he breaks his arm, there's no way he can pay for it. If this person breaks his arm, he might be able to pay for it. But if there's some more serious illness, how are they going to pay for it? So, these politicians who care so much for the people created a new program. What do you think is next on this list? So I have the two M's for Medicare, Medicaid. So with Medicare, Medicaid, is that voluntary or mandatory? Who pays for it? Does it affect you directly or indirectly? So again, all of those questions. And when it comes down to who created Social Security? Politicians. Who created Medicare, Medicaid? Yeah, remember the politicians who care so much for the people, right? So, okay, now go ahead and draw the line across, because whether you're affected directly or indirectly, it causes the dollar amount that you need in order to survive and stay out of jail. In order for you to stay alive and stay out of jail, you have to have more income in order to go out and do and accomplish and that kind of stuff. So, everybody with me? Now next, if I remember correctly, next is, go ahead, hit the button, it should be compliance costs. Yes, CC stands for compliance costs. Now a compliance cost is when the politicians write a piece of legislation and that piece of legislation causes money to come out of your pocket, but that money doesn't go to the government. Okay, so if they write a piece of legislation, it causes money to come out of your pocket, but it goes to the government, I'm classifying that as a tax on the submersion chart. But a compliance cost is the politician writes a law, it's money that's forced out of your pocket, but it goes to someone else other than the government. In this category, it would be something like minimum wage. Okay, so a politician writes a law, it's money that's forced out of an employer's pocket, but it doesn't go to the government, it goes to the employees. Okay, so those are compliance costs. Another example of compliance costs are environmental regulations. So one of the things that's been happening recently is the Navajo power plant, the Navajo generating station in northern Arizona. The EPA is coming in and saying, well, if you don't clean up your whatever, then you're going to be fined a huge amount. Now, of course, the fine is a huge amount, but of course, putting all of the stuff together to comply with that regulation, that also costs a huge amount. So whether the Navajo generating station, go ahead and hit the line, whether the Navajo generating station pays the fine, you're going to be paid more for electricity, or if they actually put all of the stuff in place to comply with the regulation, you're going to be paying more for your electricity. So those are compliance costs. Can anyone think of another compliance cost off the top of your head? Accounting, ooh, absolutely. Every single April 15th, okay, people take time, effort, energy, they pay someone else just to comply with the laws in place. So you're absolutely right. Is there another one before we move on? Okay, well, actually I want to move on. We are going pretty quick. So next, INF. INF stands for inflation. So on the chart up top, then you go ahead and just use the abbreviation, but down on the bottom, write inflation. And all of these things apply. So, I mean, with inflation, is it voluntary or mandatory? Well, you have no choice of what the dollar does it? So you are forced to comply with all of this stuff going on. And of course, who pays the price for inflation? Well, anyone who saves money. Anyone who's on a fixed income, they are hurt by far, they are hurt the most when it comes to inflation. So of course that goes back to the entire, are you affected directly, indirectly, or not affected? Just a question, is there anyone that has circled the N where they are not affected at all with any of the stuff being listed so far? Everybody has either been affected directly or indirectly? Surprising, isn't it? Okay, maybe not. And then of course, who causes inflation? The Fed. Well, and politicians created the Fed. The Fed are actually the ones in charge of the actual quote-unquote rates, but the Fed in and of itself, they're not the ones that write the budgets, and it's the politicians who say spend this much money, and the politicians go to the Fed, and the Fed prints it up, and because we aren't on the gold standard, all they have to do is say, or in actuality, they don't even really have to do the printing press anymore. They can just go on the computer, go click, 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 and add another decimal to the different numbers. So politicians are the origin of inflation. Well, and that is a good debate, but ultimately, the people who control the Fed, they actually had to manipulate the politicians. If the politicians said no, we would not be hurting by this. So there might be someone pulling politicians' legs.
In 1913, that was the case.
Exactly. But the thing is, so with that, you might write someone else as far as the politicians, or as far as who created inflation. But if we stayed with the Constitution and stayed on a gold standard, then we would not be affected by inflation, not anywhere like we are being affected right now. So, so that's with inflation. And everybody understands, you're a pretty awesome crowd. You know and understand economics to the point where you know and understand where inflation is. So if I go and buy a chair 3 years ago, that chair, or maybe even longer than 3 years ago, but let's say that the chair was $15 10 years ago. Now it costs more, not because the chair's more expensive, it's just because the dollar value is less. So therefore you need more dollars to buy the exact same chair. But again, when it goes to the bottom line, it's raising that bottom line because you have to come up with more dollars just to be where you were yesterday. So everybody got inflation? Okay, so what's next? Oh, actually, before I do what's next, remember I went back here, so Mr. Rich Guy, at this point, he might be able to buy, he can buy a car with cash, no problem. He might have to save up a little bit for a house, but he can buy a car with cash. This guy, he can't buy a house with cash. He can't buy a car with cash. He has to finance it. He has to finance those things. But what about these people? These people are to a point where they very well could be financing groceries. How many people know people that have put groceries on credit cards? At least heard about, okay, maybe you don't know them directly, but how many people have actually heard about people putting groceries on credit cards? Okay, a few more hands, thank you. But that's where these people are. These people here, they have hardly any freedom at all. They are dependent. Their will is no longer their own. I mean, Mr. Poor Guy, he has this much discretion, but if he wants to have any kind of freedom, he has to get this high, he has to develop himself, he has to learn and grow and do all of that. He has to work this hard just to get his nose above water. So all of these things, as far as the poor people are concerned, if you want them to break free, all of these things are making it more and more difficult. But going back to this. So, Mr. Rich Guy, he is probably financing a few things, not very much, but he is financing a few things, and from here all the way over, they're all financing stuff. So, what happens to, hit the button, what happens to interest rates? Law of supply and demand. The more people who are borrowing money, what happens to the interest rates? Exactly, law of supply and demand. So in order to comply, in order to make sure that you are paying for everything that you need to pay for and staying out of jail and also making sure you have enough to eat, that dollar amount, in order for you to just get by, that dollar amount has to be bigger and bigger and bigger. And then continue through with the, is it voluntary and mandatory? Who actually controls the interest rates? And does anyone in this room control the interest rates? Okay, so it's someone else, so then it would fit into the mandatory thing, unless you do not finance anything at all. In fact, Lots of people say, well, I want to have a phenomenal credit score. I want to have a really, really high credit score. My personal opinion, I want my credit score to be 0. Absolutely 0. That's where I want my credit score, because that means I am not borrowing any money from anyone anywhere. Because I don't remember. Barbara, did you use the quote, the Samuel Adams quote, there are 2 ways to captivate a society? I'm totally butchering the quote, but one of them is through conquest and the other is through debt. Did you do that quote today? Okay, but I'm sure you're familiar with it, and I'm sure most of you are familiar with it as well. So right now, most of the people in society are captivated because of this. And you've been drawing the lines across, right? So you see this? Now, of course, there are some people, I'm not going to name any names, Michael Moore, but there are some people that would look at this and say, look at Mr. Rich Guy, see how unfair it is, he has all of that money, and all of these people, we have nothing. See the great inequality. Wait, didn't we just watch a video talking about that? But look at this great disparity between all of these people and that person. We need to tax rich people. So, the next thing on the list is taxing rich people. Now, what happens if now I know that you can't do bills of attainder, which means writing a piece of legislation that singles one person out, but let's say, just say for example, that politicians could say, Walmart, you're one of the biggest companies, and we're going to write a law where you must pay more than anybody else. So where is Walmart going to come up with that money? Exactly. They just add another penny to everything in the store, and that's where they come up with the revenue. So ultimately, who pays for it? Does Walmart pay for it? Or does everybody else? So go ahead and draw that line across there for everybody else. So even when politicians specifically target one group of individuals for a tax, ultimately who pays for it? Okay, so that's one reason I'm not huge on sin taxes. So does everyone see how people are becoming submerged, how people are losing their freedom? Even Mr. Rich Guy, he only has that much freedom now. Everybody else is becoming more and more captivated. In fact, go ahead and click the next button. If we were to take that small part on top, isn't this exactly what you'd see? Where it's flat until you get to the last part, right? So all of these parts and pieces that, okay, let's look at the very, okay, so here's the chart on your handout, and down on the bottom, the very last column. Who created all of those things? The politicians, the government, each and every single one of these things to cause the scenario in that one video, all of those things being in place is what caused that great inequality, that great disparity. So, with this information, do you think it's easy to share this with other people to say, okay, the reason that the poor get poorer is 100% absolutely, completely political? You get that connection? Now, I actually don't remember what the next slide is. Oh, yes, as far as the solutions are concerned. Now, if we were to do a flat tax, now, go ahead and hit the next one. I don't care whether the tax is an income tax or a consumption tax, a sales tax. I personally am a huge fan of the fair tax. That is by far my favorite. However, as far as us taking our nation from where it is now to where we were born to be, all I want is a flat tax. So again, I don't care whether it's an income tax or a consumption tax, as long as it is flatter than anything Michael Moore sits on, that's how flat I want the tax to be, okay? So if we do that, go ahead and click the next one. You're absolutely right. If we have a flat income tax, we don't get rid of the IRS, and that's why I'm a huge fan of the compliance costs still apply. Yes, and that's why I'm a huge fan of the fair tax. But again, if the tax is flatter, then basically it's more inverted like this. We still have all of the other parts and pieces in play. But as far as Mr. Poor Guy, how far does he have to go just to get his nose above water. Does he have to travel as far? It's a lot easier for him to get his nose out of the water, right? And if we care about poor people, then a flat tax is by far the number one best way to help them get on their own 2 feet, right? Comment.
The alternate to a tax is to cut spending.
Oh, absolutely. And of course, with anything on this list, the more the government spends, the bigger that category is. In fact, if we go back to the original ones, actually, if you just look at what you have written on your handouts, every single one of those categories. Now, remember when I did, it was Social Security that was first, right? The one at the very, very bottom. Well, above taxes. But above taxes, the next thing, because taxes are justifiable. I mean, we do deserve to have a military and armed forces, and yes, we need to pay for that. So everything in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, that's awesome. We need to do more and more of that. But of course, when we're talking about stuff outside of the Constitution, then we're making the tax category bigger. And of course, looking on your handout, the more people who were underwater, does that mean more people or less people are going to be on Social Security? More people will be on that. So you can actually take that line and stretch it out some. So the more people who are dependent on these different programs, you can inflate those lines. So you can actually stretch those lines and move them up. The more people who are actually underwater in those categories. So whoever mentioned, I think you mentioned that, you brought up a great point, because if we reduce spending, then we take that water line and bring it down a little bit. If we have fewer people on Social Security, as in they can afford their own retirement and they're not taking the government's retirement, they opt out, well, that actually takes that submersion chart and brings it down. Of course, I mean, if one person does it, it's no big deal. It's a raindrop in the ocean. But if a whole bunch of people do it, then it can make a tremendous impact. And the more people doing the right thing, the better. So the next thing. So we talked about one thing where, oh, by the way, if we do a flat tax, the entire, you'll see the abbreviations where we have the, here it is, we have the taxes and the Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. So all of those would be wrapped into the tax, and we don't have the tax on the rich anymore because it's a flat tax, and the tax doesn't care about if you're rich or poor. It's fair for everybody. So that's why you don't see the tax for the money people. But next, the gold standard. If we were to return to a gold standard, what would happen to, click it again, what would happen to the category of inflation? It's no longer a factor. Now we might be trapped at whatever, if we return to the gold standard, we might be locked at that, but it's no longer a factor anymore. So if the economy gets better, well, it's still locked, the inflation rate is still locked in that position. So you see how that adds hope if we're part of the gold standard.
What if there is no gold in Fort Knox like the rumors keep saying?
Well, great question, and that's probably one of the reasons why we haven't returned to the gold standard. But that's one of the reasons why, well, that's one of the reasons why we as individuals need to be part of the solution instead of waiting for politicians to be part of the answer. Yes, did everyone hear that? Okay, so essentially the amount of gold that we have available right now, essentially in the market, there might be some that we don't have access to yet that don't fit in this category, but if we were to take all of the gold on the planet and melt it down into one single solitary block, it would be one block that's 70 feet by 70 feet by 70 feet, a cube that big of solid gold. So yeah, so Ralph is saying that it would fit in this room. So, I mean, that's how rare gold is, and that's why it would stop inflation, because there's only that amount, so if you can't really spend more. And of course, Jim Pinkerman.
Difficult to inflate gold or silver, but it's in the hands of the people. It's not in the hands of the government. And that's what the founding fathers wanted. They wanted the capital to be in the hands of the people, and that's what gold and silver do.
Right. So, yeah, Jim makes a brilliant point. If we have a gold standard, then we, the people, are the regulators instead of just a handful of bureaucrats or the Federal Reserve people or the people pulling the strings of the Federal Reserve. So if we have a gold standard, you're absolutely right. It's market-driven, it's market-stable, it's not a few people pulling the strings. So let's do sort of the next thing. What if we apply the 10th Amendment? A whole massive amount of all of these different problems, say for example EPA regulations or compliance costs when it comes to the schools, or I mean list off any of the alphabet agencies. Yeah, actually go ahead and do just a few right now. So EPA, what else? FDA, what else? Department of Education, absolutely. What else? The welfare, IRS, yes, all of these. Exactly. So a whole bunch of these massive things, if we were to actually apply the 10th Amendment and get the federal government out of it, what would happen to compliance costs? Go ahead and hit the next one. Now, of course, according to each state you live in, there might be compliance costs going up and down, but that's a variable that you are actually in control of. If you want to go to a state that has massive education budget, and you have to comply with all of these regulations and you can't do homeschool, if there's a state doing that and you want that, guess what? That is now voluntary. It is no longer forced upon you because you now have a choice, because you can go to that state. And if there's another state that doesn't have any of those regulations and you can homeschool your kid and you can just plug them into some video and the video will tell them how to run a nuclear thorium reactor, which thorium nuclear reactors are awesome, by the way. But, you know, plug your kid into a video and he learns about that. Well, if you want to do that, that's awesome. You now have a choice. You can go to any extreme or any state that's somewhere in between those. You now have a choice. It is in your hands. It's not in the hands of some gray-suited politician 2,000 miles away. And, of course, those gray-suited politicians, you know how much that they... I want you guys to do it with me this time. Put your hand over your heart. And you say, the politicians who care so much for the people. Okay, so let's do it together. Ready? The politicians who care so much for the people. Now, before I'm very close to the end, but I do want to mention this little thing. Somewhere in the ballpark of about 2 years ago, a year and a half, 2 years ago, maybe 2.5 years ago, I really don't remember anymore. I was actually sitting with one other person, well, actually 2 other people in a booth at some restaurant, and it was Matt Salmon who was in that booth. So I gave this presentation, this submersion chart. I did this little presentation to Matt Salmon and one of his aides and one of my friends. It was actually Greg Western, for those of you who know. So it was the 4 of us sitting at the table, and I did the exact same thing that I do all the time, which is, you know, the politicians who care so much for the people. And I was doing that right in front of Matt Salmon, and do you know what I was thinking? Absolutely nothing. I have done this so many times that I was completely on autopilot. I wasn't even thinking, oh yeah, this is one of the politicians that I'm actually doing this in front of. But here's the magic thing about it. Do you think Matt Salmon knows and understands a whole bunch of this stuff? Do you think he has any problem with trying to reduce all of those regulations and all of the different compliance costs? He wants to bring those down. So me doing that in front of him, you know, I realized that on the drive home, I just realized, oh no, I did the politicians who care so much for the people. I realized that on the drive home, and I just, oh my goodness, I can't believe I did that in front. But I have done this so many times, and just, if you are doing this, if you're doing this presentation, and I actually intentionally did it sort of simplified, where, you know, you write the letter T for tax, and you draw the line across, and you write the SS for Social Security, and draw. This is something that I wanted for you to be able to write down on a napkin. So as long as you can remember those 7 different steps, then you can actually share this with other people. But I found, this is one of the little tricks of the trade that I don't really share with a whole bunch of people, but since you guys are awesome, I'm sharing this with you. One of the fastest ways to convey the entire politicians do not have your best interest in mind is that entire dripping with sarcasm, the politicians who care so much for the people. So me saying that sarcastically is actually one of the best ways to get that idea across to someone else. And that's why, for that purpose, for you to be able to convey that to someone else, I actually want to practice that one more time. So I want everybody to put on their opera faces and pretend like, in fact, if you want to stand up, go ahead and stand up and you can flail around. I want you to be as dramatic as possible because this is the one, again, this is one of the best ways to convey. Now, when you're doing it with someone else at the restaurant, you don't have to be as dramatic as possible. But here in this room, in order to lock this information into your brain, then if you want to stand up and be as dramatic as you want to. But we're going to do it, I think, 3 more times. So we'll do but everybody at least put your hand over your heart and as sappily as you possibly can, say with me, the politicians who care so much for the people. Okay, so that's one. Now everybody get a little sappier. I mean, if you want to, close your eyes because everybody is worried about how everybody thinks about them, but nobody's actually thinking about you. You're just thinking about them thinking about you, but they're actually not thinking about you. They're actually thinking about them. So if you want to close your eyes, if it makes it that easier to be sappier. Okay, hand over your heart. The politicians who care so much for the people. Ooh, that was awesome. That was a lot better than last time. Okay, do you think you could make it even sappier? One last time. Very last time. Oh, yes, I'll do it this time so the microphone, so all of the recordings can actually hear you and not hear me. So in other words, be loud so your voices can actually hit the microphone. On your mark, get set. Awesome. Yeah, you know what? Give yourselves a round of applause. That was awesome. Fantastic. So, okay, but I'm actually supposed to end in just a few minutes, and we have just a few slides left. What if we as individuals become debt-free? What happens? Yes, Ralph just said that if a vast majority of us are debt-free, then it screws up what they're trying to do, what the Fed is doing with the fractional reserve banking and all of that kind of stuff. Yes, first and foremost, we're free, but second of all, we're actually screwing up the bad guys, absolutely. So we do the next thing. They have less control of us, and that goes back to the Samuel Adams quote. There's 2 ways to dominate. I really need to learn this word perfect, but you guys are getting the idea, the Samuel Adams quote. There are 2 ways to dominate a nation. One is through conquest, through the sword, and the other is through debt, through the fractional reserve banking and what you mentioned with the Federal Reserve and the people pulling the... Exactly. So if we as individuals become debt-free, what happens to all of these different compliance costs? How easy is it... Oh, go back to the... the other button. Yeah. So if we are able to do all of that, how easy is it for Mr. Poor Guy to get his nose above water? Absolutely much easier. In fact, to a certain extent, their noses might be above water at that point. So this is one of the reasons why, that is why we need to move that direction. Okay, so now we can move to the next, which brings us to a question. How easy is it for us as individuals to implement all of these things? So if we do the next one, how is it for us as individuals to impose a flat tax? Exactly. As individuals, we as individuals cannot do this. Now, of course, we can, every election cycle, we can actually go and make sure that, okay, there's some politician saying, hey, vote for me to be your representative in Congress. Well, if we as individuals are in meetings and we ask them, what do you think about a flat tax? Well, if they like a flat tax, what are you going to do on election day? If they don't like a flat tax, if they like the progressive tax, what are you going to do on election day? Exactly. So you vote the good guys in and then you vote the bad guys out. Can you do that every day? No, you can only do that one day every other year. However, can you teach other people about a flat tax? Can you teach other people about less government spending? Can you do that stuff? You can teach other people every day But of course, when it really, really matters, as far as getting the right people in place, you can only do that every other year. So voting is massively important, but we can't do that all the time. So in order for us to actually do something, then as far as a flat tax is concerned, then what we can do every week, every day, is we can teach people about stuff. And that's why I want to make all of this information simple enough where it's easy to convey to other people. So next, what about the gold standard? Can we as individuals put a gold standard out on the rest of the world? On the rest of the world? No, not at all. On the nation, can we do something to impress a gold standard on the nation? It would be the same way as the flat tax. We can do something about it individually. We can do something about that solution every other year, just one time, when we vote. Yes, exactly. In the states, we actually have more power with it. So you can actually, on the state level, you can help persuade politicians that way. But of course, getting the right politicians, again, that's once every election cycle. So as far as you actively pursuing this personally, well, as far as the government gold standard, you can only do that one day every other year. But as far as the state level, moving the state to a gold standard, those of you who have influence, you can actually do more than just one day every other year. You can actually probably do a few days a year if you're going and talking to the different representatives. But ultimately, and I'm halfway thinking that you might be getting to the point, Jim Pinkerman, once again.
We've had a bill for 3 years that has been down by certain individuals up at the state capitol to allow it in the state a gold standard that is not taxed, like what do they call the tax that I can
Yeah, instead of treating
no capital gains tax on gold and silver because it is money according to the Constitution.
exactly. So there's a state bill that's been in
Lost out because of one individual in each case. A committee head in one case and the governor twice, including the new governor.
Yep, so
Understand this. But we still have a champion, Representative Pincham, who is going to push it again.
absolutely, and we need to continue pushing that because if you didn't hear, basically there is a bill in the Arizona State Legislature where they are trying to help encourage people to use more gold. So instead of using gold as a commodity and the government being able to tax transactions of gold, then it would be actually used as currency, and therefore the government can't tax you for paying for stuff with gold and that kind of stuff, which that would be brilliant. That's actually a way that we as individuals can start using a gold standard. And of course, if we have a supply of gold and whatever as a reserve against inflation, et cetera, that's good. But time is running fast. The 10th Amendment, how much can we do about the 10th Amendment right now? For the most part, it's sort of the same thing where we have to elect the right people and they can do something about it. However, do you remember with the Constitutional County Project? Who spoke, was it last week or the week before? But the Constitutional County people, if we have sheriffs and we encourage them, with Sam Payne, exactly. If we have those kinds of people stepping out, then we can actually do something about that. Of course, if me as an individual, if I see that there's some terrible EPA regulation and I say, well, the EPA shouldn't be doing that, the states should be doing that, well, I personally could do something about that, but of course I'm going to be locked into a court case for years and years and years and years. So that's why it's actually difficult for a single individual to go that track, but it is possible if you were that diligent. And then trying to wrap this up really quick, a balanced budget. As far as us getting politicians to balance their budget, that's actually pretty tough. However, how easy is it for us to balance our own budget? Someone here's already done it, and how easy is it for us to balance our own budget?
It isn't easy because of the complications of the nation not balancing their budget, and it's a fantasy to believe that we can balance a budget when we're on fiat money where they can create money out of nothing and flood the market with it.
Yep.
We have to get back
For
If we pay attention to the 10th Amendment, instead of an Article 5 Amendment Convention, which they're pushing, if we pay attention to the Constitution and the enumerated powers and get back to the gold standard, that would solve it.
well,
There's nothing wrong with the Constitution. We don't need another amendment.
but then ultimately, if we, well, what I'm trying to do is, and I am trying to wrap this up because it's time to quit, but all of these things, on a national scale, it's very difficult for us as individuals to do. However, if we go back to, and go ahead and click, I think that's, what can you as individuals actually do? And as far as doing, there's 3 things that I listed. You can learn about the stuff, you can actually act upon it, as in if you get out of debt yourself, that's actions that you can actually do every day. You don't have to wait every other year to get out of debt. You can get out of debt this year if you have the right kind of, well, financial fitness wisdom. So what can you do this year? What can you do this week? What can you actually do today? And ultimately, learning is something that you can do every single day. Every single day you can learn something. And of course, the more you learn, the more you're able to act on stuff. And of course, through your actions, you'll actually have the experience to share this with other people. And ultimately, what I would really encourage all of you to do is know and understand the principles of finances so that each and every single one of you in this room can actually be on that end of the spectrum so that your nose will always be out of the water. I want the best for each and every single one of you in this room. I know that the government is actually suppressing the abilities of us as individuals. And the more people who are free, the better our nation will be for it. And that's one of the reasons why, again, I developed this so you guys can learn it and you can share it, and more people will get out of that government submersion so we can get our noses out and we can actually have fun. Life is supposed to be fun. So that's the presentation.